Can I? Yeah.
Your last, yeah.
I'll stumble along behind you.
Live also.
Hello, everyone. I've got two mics. So, welcome to Dulcie's King's Cross, and welcome to another talk of sold-out proportions regarding Juanita Nielsen and the disappearance that happened 45 years ago. Last weekend was the 45th anniversary of her disappearance. It's still very much up in the air as to what happened, how it happened, and where she is. So hopefully this chat with Duncan will shed some new light. You've got the absolute pleasure this week of getting a bit more insight. Duncan's had a couple of talks with people throughout the past week, and the story has evolved. Crazy. I was shook when I heard it. But this week we also have the very modern invention of live streaming. So not only do you guys get to enjoy, you guys get it with cocktails and food from us, but we also have a live stream on YouTube at the moment. So do I shout out to those people? Hello.
We all do.
Yeah, say hello. No, you can't be heard, you don't have mics. I'm also quite sweaty because I was in the bar making drinks and then I've run down. That's the magic of small bars. That fourth wall is very much gone. Before I go any further about Duncan and welcome him to the stage, for the people that have never heard this talk from me before, Dulcie's used to be one of the worst strip clubs in the Cross. There was no license, there was no DA. When I came down here with a real estate agent, he was like, "Don't touch the walls, you'll get pregnant." Like, no word of a lie. And then I was like, "Ha," and he's like, "No, don't actually make physical contact." It was all brick walls, there was gold, there was TVs in the corners because at one stage they tried to claim they were a cinema when the City of Sydney said, well, you actually have to pretend you're something. So they put TVs in the walls, and when we pulled them off the walls, we took the VCRs out and they'd been jammed in there, and it was like a 1973 film, which was colourful. And then we basically gutted it and created a bar that represented 1930s King's Cross and the people who used to frequent the Cross long before drugs and sex and all of that became commonplace. Long before the disappearance of Juanita Nielsen, we wanted to showcase what the Cross was like in the 30s for the artists and the bohemians. I'm very sweaty and this light's very unforgiving, so let's hope the live stream doesn't see that. But I hope you enjoy. I hope you get a lot out of this talk, and I hope you come back because we're planning to do a lot more. The City of Sydney has created an amazing opportunity for us to upgrade all of our systems, so much more live feeds in the future, much more kind of talks like this. We're starting to get back into our performances, so burlesque, cabaret, all of those fun, sexy things. So yeah, I'll now welcome to the stage Duncan McNab, who would like me to introduce him as a vagabond.
Hello.
Which
Good evening.
I don't know what that means, really. But essentially he was the man about town in regards to detective work in the Cross. During what periods?
Late 70s to the mid 80s, I think.
You could turn it on, I think.
That'd be very helpful. Yes.
There we go.
Late 70s. I arrived in the Cross as a detective in 1980 in January. I was a child, but it was an interesting time. Yeah. Yeah.
And excellent. So we're going to start. The way that today will go is we've got three different sections. The first section we will lay the groundwork for the whole Juanita Nielsen moment. We'll have a break. You'll get more drinks. You will get more drinks. And then we'll go into our second section, which is basically a blow-by-blow account of the disappearance and hopefully the latest information.
There will be an update.
I'm actually really excited for it. So, I just want to see your faces at that moment because I was like, done. And then the third piece will be a Q&A. So what we'll do is we'll put around a whole heap of cards after the second section. Those streaming online will be able to submit questions. Is that possible? Yes. Okay, good.
Good Lord.
And then we'll answer those questions in a kind of fun style in that third section. Then you're free to go or stay for more drinks. So, Duncan, I'll leave it over to you. Tell us.
Thank you very much. Lovely to see you all again. It's great. I suppose just let's begin by talking about Juanita and telling everyone who she was. Just as a glimpse, I didn't grow up around here, but we had lots of family around here. My great-grandparents and so on, all they lived around here. We would come across the Harbour Bridge, which is something that's horrifying for me going the other way these days. And we'll visit them first. You'd come via Woolloomooloo, you'd visit the relatives in Potts Point and Elizabeth Bay, and then for that treat, you'd go around Macleay Street and head down the very dirty half mile in those days to look at the neon, the prostitutes, the crooks, the street workers, everywhere. This wonderful cluster of people all illuminated in flashing neon. It was wonderful. Wasn't very interested in seeing the relatives, but that last trip home was the best part. This is around about the time Juanita was becoming popular in the cross. She was incredibly well known, in part because she was utterly charming, in part because she was unusual. She came from an extraordinarily wealthy, very high social echelon family. She was the great-granddaughter of Mark Foy, who was one of our city's leading retailers back a long time ago. You had Mark Foy's and David Jones at the absolute top tier. Everyone else was sort of not quite considered appropriate. I used to go to Mark Foy's before I started school with my grandmother and my aunts, and they'd go in there to buy silk stockings and gloves. It was that sort of store. These days, it's full of young blokes at the Downing Centre wearing Roger David suits that you wouldn't want to get too close to a naked flame. Things have changed, but you can still see
nylon.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah, and they only wear it to court, which some of them wear regularly in between lengthy sentences, shall we say. Yeah, you wear the court suit and you come out of jail and you're looking a bit more buff.
Can I just give it, Mark Foy is one of the most amazing people, and probably as an enigma as Juanita Nielsen, but he never disappeared, he just did a lot of weird shit. Mark did this amazing thing. If anyone's been to Medlow Bath up in the mountains and the Hydro Majestic, Mark Foy bought that, and in an effort to make it one of the world's most quintessential European day spas, he shipped the water from Europe in copper vats. Yeah. So he shipped all the water from Europe, it arrived here, got trucked up to the mountain, put into the Medlow Bath, and then as you can expect from having water sit in a lot of copper, everyone got copper poisoning. But he loved it. He also developed the flying coloured squadron of boats on the harbour.
Yeah,
so he wanted to go sailing, and he wanted to use coloured sails, and everyone in Sydney was like, absolutely not, that's disgusting. How times have changed. And so he established a brand new yacht squadron. So he's quite an interesting man. And if you ever want to look him up, have a read, because he's fascinating.
It's an interesting background too, because whilst back in the 60s and early 70s, we were quite conservative, even though there was eruptions of colour here and there. Juanita was unusual as well, because she went to PLC at Pimple, so you don't get much more genteel than that. She then started working as a glove model in the family business. She had these remarkably long fingers. If you ever see a picture of her, apart from the beehive, have a look at her hands. They are quite unusual. But she got bored with all that. In about 1962, she packed up, and instead of going to London, as every kid did in those days, she went to Japan, where she married a Danish sailor, whose name was Nielsen, hence the Juanita Nielsen. They sort of mucked around the world for a couple of years, living in Denmark, unsurprisingly, Morocco, London, and so on. Then she got bored with him, frankly. So she came back to Australia, resumed work in the glove department at Mark Foy's. She was a bit bolshy, and she and her father had a huge dispute at one stage. She led a shareholder revolt against her father. Her father was planning on selling a large tranche of shares to another retailer called McDowell's, which a few people may vaguely remember. It was sort of a bit quite down market. They had shops in DY and other places, and you didn't want to know about that. So it was a bit below the Mark Foy's brand. So they had this carry-on for a number of years. She eventually resolved it with her father, and in 1967 he bought her a house at 202 Victoria Street, which is still there. It's got a plaque outside, you can't miss it. Typical Sydney little terrace house, bald face, walk straight into the lounge room, 2 rooms downstairs, toilet and bathroom out the back, a very narrow staircase, which if you had a beehive, you'd really have trouble negotiating. I was there a couple of nights back. The gentleman who now owns it invited me around for a look. And if you're over about 5'10", you probably risk decapitating yourself heading up the stairs. And that's where she was running Now newspaper. To keep money happening, she started up a little local newspaper called Now, which survived in advertising. So she'd walk around the streets of the city inveigling retailers to advertise with her. And a couple of people here have advertised with her. She also bumped into a young bloke called Abe Saffron, who advertised his brand spanking new Venus Room as Australia's first cocktail bar and elegant dining, neither of which was terribly accurate. Within a couple of years, it was actually described as a disorderly house by the New South Wales Police, and we'll get to the Venus Room later on because it does pop up in the local stories. When I remember the Venus Room in 1980, you'd wander in there. It was full of coppers, crooks, sometimes together, drag queens, trannies who were working upstairs in the multiple rooms above the bar, every ne'er-do-well you can find, and sailors. I remember getting very drunk there one night and ending up having a guided tour of HMAS Melbourne. I don't know how I got there, and I'm not too sure how I left, but yeah, it was good. It was great fun, and back in those days, when we had interesting licensing laws, a little more difficult than now, you had to indicate that you were going to eat to drink after 6 o'clock at night. So behind the bar at the Venus Room, they had a superannuated sausage roll and a warmer. So if an honest policeman ever turned up and asked, which was highly unlikely, you could point to the sausage roll and say, "There's dinner." It sort of satisfied the laws. And it'd be a place you'd wander in. There would be drag queens dancing on the bar top. I found it fascinating. It was a great place. It pops up in the story later on. But so Juanita is working across, and she's incredibly popular. She is, for those of us who work in television too, you've got that, some stories stay with you forever because there's that one remarkable photograph. And Juanita has that one remarkable photograph. Elegant, and this massive hairstyle. So you see her everywhere and you can't forget her. She's etched into your mind. So Juanita's running the local newspaper. A gentleman called Frank Tiemann turns up. Now Frank is back in New South Wales at that time, the Cross was this intriguing mess of people. It was about 1 square kilometre full of judges, lawyers, well-to-do businessmen, retired military officers, all that sort of stuff. Sex workers, prostitutes, criminals, bent coppers, bent politicians, all squeezed into one little box pretty much. And that's what made it so bloody exciting. Into this walked Frank Tiemann. Frank was an emigre like a lot of the property developers who thrived under Premier Bob Askin. Now, Bob was an interesting bloke, often said to be the most corrupt politician in New South Wales history. I think he had some reasonable competition, but he was certainly the most brazen. Possibly only trumped by the Premier, who used to collect his own money from the casino around the corner in Kellett Street because he thought the coppers were trying to clip him. And the lovely way of the Cross, no one really worried that he was being paid money. They worried he was double parking his wife's car at Kellett Street and then messing the street up. Anyway, so Askin has these cronies, and there are a couple of them who feature in the story. Frank Tiemann was one, and the other one was a guy called Paul Strasser, who later became a knight for no apparent reason apart from possibly a large amount of money. Strasser was the first person to get excited about developing Victoria Street. The train was coming finally. After 100 years of building the Eastern Suburbs Railway, there was finally a chance it might arrive. So King's Cross is looking really intriguing as a development site. Victoria Street is a dump. The beautiful terrace houses that you see there still today were pretty ramshackle, and they were run squatters, students short of money, people who couldn't get a housing commission slot. A lot of them didn't have running water, a lot of them didn't have gas or electricity. It was a hard life. So Tiemann scooped up a lot of those, as did Strasser. Strasser was the one who switched Juanita on to what the power of the media and complaining a lot could do. Strasser wanted to build beside 202 a 28-storey block of apartments and put, for some completely obscure reason, a concrete walkway over Victoria Street. God knows why, but that's what he wanted to do. She was horrified that she would lose everything of the ambience of her house. So she campaigned loudly against Strasser, and she won. So he didn't get what he wanted, and he eventually went away for a while. On the other side of the road, Frank Tiemann is scooping up property and he's bragging to all his mates that his development of Victoria Street would be worth around $200 million in profits to him, which these days is a decent amount of money. Those days it's a vast amount of money. And his idea was to shove the squatters and the low-income tenants out and introduce them to the delights of Mount Druitt and the Housing Commission. Understandably, they weren't too keen on that idea, so they decided to stay. So for one of those rare moments in that particular time, we had a lot of insurrection. We'd had Vietnam protests, I suppose, which had given some of the people a bit of a taste to protest. So 73 onwards, the local residents of Victoria Street started protesting against Frank Tiemann. It was the time of the Green Bans, which also saved the rocks. Two protagonists were quite prominent. On one part we had the BLF led by a bloke called Jack Mundy, who only died recently. And his ally in the cross became Juanita Neilson, the local newspaper woman. And she went from being advertising small features, social gossip, all that sort of stuff, to a reasonably hardline advocate for the residents. She formed the Victoria Street Ratepayers Association, many of whom didn't pay rates, but that doesn't matter. And she started fighting very, very publicly. She became the voice of the protest. And whenever you see her at a protest meeting, there's some old film clips, very few of them. Here is this striking-looking human being standing at the front, and there's this ragtag group of builders, labourers, and the locals, all upset, all up in arms, all fighting just for their houses. Tiemann's response was quite aggressive. He hired an ex-copper who is dead, so we can say this quite cutly, a guy called Fred Cray, who was credited with killing quite a number of people, including a few colleagues. And Fred was just this great, big, ugly bruiser. He was the 60s answer to Roger Rogerson without the style. And so Fred organised groups of thugs to wander around the houses at night, bashing doors down, dragging people out, throwing them on the streets, terrorising them into departing. One of his hired gentlemen was a guy called Joe Meisner, who became quite famous, one for being a judo champion, and secondly for being on board something called the Love Boat in the harbour, which allegedly featured a woman called Virginia Perger, who's still around, his girlfriend, a rather large item which wasn't a feather duster, and a Labor senator. This, of course, is all anecdotal.
That's a lie. He told this story in great detail, which goes beyond anecdotes. So we'll talk about this later. Just flag that, though, because it's a great story.
Live streaming. Anyway, so a very colourful group of people. I guess that's right, back on task. So Juanita is getting really, really upset about it, but the catalyst, and I only found this by just digging through some old newspapers recently, the catalyst for her anger about Tiemann was not only the local issue, but the death of a woman called Esther Blaskhouse or Esther George. The reporting isn't particularly good. She was an Aboriginal woman. She was 24 years old. She lived in Victoria Street. She'd been there a while. She wandered out one night, had a couple of drinks in the cross, brought a bloke back with her. She had a look at him and she decided he wasn't quite appropriate, so she turfed him out and went to bed calmly that night. Her house burnt down with her in it, and she died. Her house didn't have running water, it didn't have any gas, it didn't have any electricity, and there was no apparent reason for the fire. The New South Wales Police, as they did often on these occasions, looked at it and weren't terribly interested. And Juanita wrote this extraordinary editorial in Now magazine where she talked about Esther's death, and she said something along the lines of, if this had been a person from Pimble or Panania, they would have been treated as a victim of fire and arson. In Esther's case, she was just a derelict and cast aside, and she's pretty much disappeared. And that was the catalyst for her getting really, really angry. So that level of power that she had in the media increased. She just didn't give up. Fast forward a bit, and we move along to May 1975. And in May 1975, she is still incredibly vocal. Victoria Street is still a problem. Frank's managing to get a few buildings up, but he's having difficulties. He's paying $3,000 a day in interest payments just on his holdings. He's seeing the potential sales go down the gurgler. The place is going to be horribly delayed, and Frank is hemorrhaging. His creditors are tapping on his door. He's not very happy at all. So they decide that something has to be done. And this is speculative, of course, but Juanita has to go or be taught a lesson. Now, he'd had a reasonable amount of success before this as a fellow protester called Arthur King. And poor old Arthur was at home in bed one night, and this is how these guys operate. Arthur was just calmly snoozing away when all of a sudden two big, seriously big blokes turn up, drag him naked from the bed, drag him out to the street and put him in the boot of a 1952 Chrysler. And they take him for a ride for 3 days. They stop at motels, they spend the night there. Arthur's dragged back, shoved into the boot, and they drive him around. They eventually get back to the cross and they throw him out in the street. And the two blokes, two enormous, these huge thugs, introduce themselves. One of them, I think, was the gentleman whose grandfather was murdered by the crime queen, Kate Leigh, back in the 30s. He'd made the mistake of coming up from Melbourne to do a couple of robberies and decided to burgle a house in Surrey Hills, not realising that the little old lady who owned it was Kate Leigh. So he's burglarising the house merrily. Kate comes down in a dressing gown with a shotgun and blows him into the weeds. So that was the end of him. Curiously enough, I think his great-grandson turned out to be Christopher Dale Flannery, a little cross local at one stage, turned out to be his partner in many crimes. That's how the underworld is a fascinating, complex place. Anyway, so Arthur wanders off. So Juanita's heard the story, so maybe they think they can scare her like Arthur, terrify her into stopping. So, and this is where it's particularly curious, she goes off to the Carousel nightclub, which is still there now, the delightful Empire Hotel, is it, I think?
The Divine Empire.
The Divine Empire Hotel.
The
Divine Empire.
Yeah, the untouchable.
Yeah. She goes there on the morning of the 4th of July 1975 to sell them ostensibly to sell them some advertising space. She's got a call from the proprietor of this fine establishment to go up and do business. Now, at that stage, the Empire, Carousel, Les Girls, whatever you want to call it, was owned ultimately by Abe Saffron, who at that stage was the boss of the Cross. Abe had been very hands-off for years. He'd pretty much since the Roosevelt in the early 50s, he'd stepped back and bought buildings and put someone in to run them. He moved out of the Roosevelt because he'd had some problems with the law. It had been declared a disorderly house, which means the coppers could turn up and raid it without a warrant, because Abe was committing the dreadful crime of selling booze late at night.
That late at night is past 6 o'clock at that stage.
Yeah. Abe had pioneered a method by which he could ostensibly legally sell booze provided you ordered it before 6 o'clock, which wasn't quite how it worked, but it looked good. And Abe at that stage, and I chatted to him at some length about this years ago, he said it was that stage he realised that he always wanted to be one of us, but he's in fact always thought of as one of them. Small, hated sport, Jewish, working class background, the establishment loathed him, but oddly enough they'd come to his club every night and drink there, and they'd be the best of friends. But the next morning he'd see them in court at a Royal Commission where he was in terrible strife, and at the bar table there's a few of his clients giving him a hard time. That's how Sydney worked, this dreadful duality. Anyway, so back to the Les Girls. Juanita goes there. It's run by a bloke called James McCartney Anderson, who at that stage was Abe's right-hand man. Jimmy is also a reasonably well-known local, big, bluff bloke. At one stage, I think he told everyone he was a former commando in the British Army, which probably wasn't quite right. He was a hairdresser and a parking officer in New Zealand at one stage, however, that was true. Jimmy arrives in Sydney. He's very personable. He's as tough as all get out, and he starts work at the Rex Hotel as a duty manager or something or other. Abe sees some ability in him and thinks that this bloke could front a number of my nightclubs. So Jimmy then becomes part of the furniture in the Cross. He occasionally, he was quite famous briefly for being caught in the Staccato strip club one night, burning. He said he'd gone in there to quell an eye. He'd been driving past, seen the club on fire, Good Samaritan races in. Unfortunately, he had a trail of petrol on the carpet and up his leg. So, again, the New South Wales Police investigated vigorously and Jimmy is found to be an innocent bystander. Good luck with that. So Jimmy's running the Carousel, he's running the Venus Room and a couple of other places around the Cross for Abe. And that puts him very much in the fit as the catalyst for Juanita's murder. What we know about Jimmy is that at the end of May, 25th of May 1975, Frank Tiemann gives him a cheque for $25,000, ostensibly to help Jimmy assist Frank's son to buy a nightclub in Bondi. Subsequently, when the nightclub owner is spoken to, the nightclub owner has no idea his club's even for sale. But somewhere in the ether is this $25,000. 5 weeks later, Juanita Nielsen is dead. On the, I think it was the end of June, two people who are also featured in the story, Eddie Trigg and Shane Martin Simmons, turn up on Juanita's door, ostensibly to kidnap her. They knock on the door. There's not criminal masterminds, these guys. They knock on the door, and Juanita's partner, David Farrell, opens the door, so they think, plan B. Plan B is most likely the morning of the 4th of July, where she's lured up to the Carousel Club ostensibly to do some business. She's abducted and murdered.
And that's where we're going to leave it. What a cliffhanger. So, have your questions. We're going to pass around cards soon, but we're going to give Duncan a break. We're probably going to have some water.
We think we will
and
have some water.
And then we're going to come back. But use this time to order any more drinks, because during the next section, it's very, you have to follow by the book, so we're not going to interrupt with, table service and stuff. So, get ready for round 2.
Thank you.
right, so before we jump straight back into part 2, I'm going to give you all a grace period of ordering, even though I just went around and asked people for drinks orders and everyone said no. Because it's really, yeah, this is the point where there can be no distractions. But there's a couple of names that keep coming up, and we'll talk about them in a bit more detail in the Q&A, because one of the most fascinating parts about owning a bar in King's Cross is hearing about all of the people who used to own a bar in King's Cross. And they love to tell you their story, and they love to tell everyone else's stories. Dawn O'Donnell is a name that comes up quite a lot, and she is probably a legend in my eyes, and probably a public nuisance in a lot of other people's eyes. Dawn O'Donnell is probably the reason we have Oxford Street and have a gay district. And not because she supported gay people being a lesbian, but because she knew they had money, which I really respect. But she saw a time when the harbour transitioned from being a working harbour and people were using the wharfs and stuff. People used to live around the wharf. So obviously the Woolloomooloo Wharf had a huge infrastructure that required people to live there and work around, because you need people to pick things up off ships and bring them back to land. Now, when there was none of that infrastructure needed, because you suddenly had the cargo ship and all the cargo containers in Botany, these areas just died. And from Woolloomooloo all the way up to Surrey Hills, there was just swathes of people leaving the area. And Dawn kind of saw all these old pubs and stuff up and down Oxford Street and asked Abe Saffron for a heap of money and kind of started investing in this area. And she bought up a whole heap of Oxford Street and started putting in the most amazing nightclubs and stuff in there. So Dawn O'Donnell is credited, weirdly enough, this is the one thing that everyone loves about her. She brought the light up checkerboard floor to Sydney. Everyone's like, oh yeah, there's that woman. That's the most normal response. She's also really famous. I called her Burnham Down Dawn before, probably for very straightforward reasons. But she used to be famous for calling drag queens and saying, hey darling, you should get all your wigs out of insert nightclub here. And then the next day it would be burnt to the ground. Which come on. Before legitimate days of finding things, if a club's not working, burn it to the ground, claim the insurance and build it again. That is entrepreneurship, I think, in my eyes. And she was really, really good at it, and she kind of became known for it. And she was a huge patron of the arts. And she during the Stonewall riots and stuff, and when she saw what happened here with Mardi Gras, she personally went and paid the bonds for all the men and women who marched in the first protest. So as much as we sit there and say she's a demon, she was also probably the patron saint of entrepreneurial gay people, which I really love. And yeah, go read more on Dawn O'Donnell. There's an amazing documentary called Crocodile Dundee. Yeah, incredible documentary. And I think there wouldn't have been a Sydney that we know of without her. We wouldn't have. She was after Les Girls, essentially. Oh, Duncan? Do you reckon she was before or after Les Girls? During Les Girls. So her along with Carlotta and Abe really kind of created this. Abe Saffron is another amazing name. If you get a chance to talk to Duncan after this, ask him about Abe Saffron's funeral. It is heaven. That's how if I die, that's how I want the church. But you have to ask Duncan about it later, because he tells it with perfect finesse. Abe essentially, as Duncan described, bought up a whole heap of places as well. And is that it for drinks? Is everything? Yeah, that's it. Great. You almost have to. There's one lady holding up her hand. I can see. Just yell it out. What do you want? Okay, great. Yeah, good. I was like, if you haven't ordered now, you haven't got it. But it's coming, so that's good. Abe was amazing. He started the Roosevelt, which is essentially, it's still around the corner. I used to work there, so I got really fascinated by the history of it. If you go there now, it's a quarter of what it used to be in size. It used to be the whole building. It used to have a mezzanine that wrapped around it. It was essentially a Gatsby's party every night of the week. And it was the place to be seen in Sydney. There was aerial artists that used to swing from the roof, big domed roof. It was incredible from all accounts. This one woman came in when I was working at the Roosevelt and told me about how she was a dancer there. And they did these amazing kind of Busby Berkeley style shows that would fit in that area. And when she told me how old she was, I started doing the maths and she was like, yes, I was 14. I was like, oh, what a wild ride. But she was saying that it was probably the most beautifully run and impeccably kind of sophisticated night spot. And you start hearing more of those stories about the Cross. One of my biggest points that I champion when I talk about King's Cross now is everyone forgets that before the 80s, there was a good Cross. And it was probably really only the late 70s, early 80s that things started changing. We've had some of the biggest names perform in the Cross: Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr. Judy Garland had a breakdown at the Silver Spade. This was like the heartbeat of the city and the cultural epicenter of Sydney. And I think we kind of forget that, and we all like talk about the old Cross as like, oh yeah, it was rad to go out and get shit-faced by like 1 a.m. and vomit in the gutter. And I'm like, yes, it was, but it's also, there's so much more to this area, and I hope people kind of start realizing that and go back and we see more things opening on Darlinghurst Road. But did you get your drink? All right, give me a minute. I'll stall, I'll keep stalling. I'm doing this for you though, so.
One coming here as well.
All right. So there's like two minutes? Great. 2 Juanitas as well. So essentially, like, I want you to like think about those places as well. The Venus Room obviously is going to get talked about later. Bottoms Up Bar, I also flagged that one for conversation. It is, I want to go to Bottoms Up Bar, and it sounds exactly as it is. Like, there is absolutely no subtlety with Bottoms Up Bar. Benny's is another good one of the most exclusive places to get into, where Lotus is now on Chalice Avenue, used to be Benny's. This idea of a nightlife existed in Sydney where any day of the week you could go to these venues and you could do exactly what you guys are doing now, or you could be the drunkest person in the room at 7 o'clock, and it would be packed. And this is what Sydney used to be like, and it's not all about drinking, and it's not about like taking drugs, and it's not about like anything other than celebrating a time to be around other people. And I think, maybe I'm biased as a bar owner, but we don't do that anymore. It's all about school nights, and I've got gym in the morning and F45, like, fuck F45. Did that get picked up for live stream? You know, like, get a sense of excitement back. I think we're in a really good position now where we've kind of, during coronavirus, I know we had to reset the way that we thought about bars and going out and stuff, and how we as bar operators operate. I think moving forward, customers need to do that. And everyone needs to like look at it and go, hey, remember that time where we couldn't go out for 3 months and we all went stir crazy? We started buying a lot of cocktails and drinking them in a space of an hour, and we'd do another takeaway order. What if we didn't exist? What if hospitality didn't exist and it was just F45s all the time? You've got to, like, everyone needs equal room to breathe, and I think we have the chance to change that at the moment. So I hope you all listen to these amazing stories of murder, intrigue, and amazing clubs, and think what a world would be like without them. How many more minutes? Like, are we making a Ramos Fizz? They take 11 minutes to make. Like, that's also history, look that up. Are you done? Has Maria got hers? All right. This lady down here, there's other people in the room. All right, Duncan, we'll start you back for the second round. As you can tell, I have a martini on the table as well, so Duncan does as well, so hopefully this will make the stories a bit more colourful. More colourful than what they already are about a woman that got killed. Duncan, we'll pick up where we left off. Juanita Nielsen goes in for a meeting about marketing in her paper for the Carousel Club. She rocks up to the Carousel Club on the 4th of July.
Yeah, 4th of July 1975. So she goes up in the morning, ostensibly, says goodbye to her partner David Farrell, goes up the road to this meeting, looking forward to getting some business too, because the Carousel had been patchy in its advertising. There wasn't really a great need to advertise. It was packed every night with punters. as was pretty much all of Abe's businesses back in those days. They had that lovely mix of booze after 6, and that's about it, and no rules. You just didn't make a fool out of yourself in the cross. And that, I suppose, just to segue briefly, it was the difference between the cross back then and the cross that we had problems with even recently. The cross looked after itself. If you got really drunk and unruly and stupid in a bar, chances are you'd be stopped before you got to that point and either taken outside and shoved headfirst into a wheelie bin, or your mates were told to take you home and bring you back when you were sobered up, or they'd shove you into the back of a cab. And doormen at the clubs were quite good like this. They would just grab you by the scruff of the neck, hurl you into the back of a cab and tell the cab driver to take you home. Sometimes they'd even throw $20 in his hand to make sure you got there. That's how this place worked. There's this remarkable confluence of coppers, locals, crims, doormen, people who survived on the strip, people who made their life out of running nightclubs, running strip clubs, looking after the mud wrestling just down the road, which was always intriguing, on the 3rd floor, and other interesting entertainments. Anyway, back to the Carousel Club. So on the morning of the 4th of July 1975, Juanita turns up there. It's around about 10:40, 11 o'clock, which is particularly early, by the way, for anyone around the cross those days. Normally that's about the time you're thinking about getting out of bed.
It still is. It's still really early for anyone who works in the cross.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually. I still remember leaving the Bourbon at 6 a.m. But that's another story. Anyway, so she disappears. Now, in the Carousel at that time, there were probably 4 people. There was Eddie Trigg, who was working there as the manager. There was his sidekick, Shane Martin Simmons, who I think may still be alive. Eddie's dead. He died in a drab room in a Waterloo hotel in 2013. And 2 very colourful people. There was Eddie's girlfriend, Madeline King, who was originally Arthur, but she was this very dramatic-looking mid-sex change. She had the most stupendous cleavage on King's Cross. Everyone was captivated by the sheer size and positioning. So she was a big draw card to the Carousel. And then the receptionist was less glamorous, a trader in mid-change called Loretta. Loretta's original name was Lawrence, I think, but Loretta's working name was Ronnie Matthews, and I was telling Brandy a couple of weeks ago about this. I was reading through some research and I thought, God, Ronnie Matthews, I remember you from 1974, 75 when I was at law school and working part-time in the courts and at Central Court of Petty Session, but just still there in the morning. It was this remarkable collation of all the debris from the cross that was arrested the night before. All the girls who'd been locked up for soliciting, they were arrested once a week with some sort of enforced taxation. I think the vice squad used to wander along and say, your turn, get in the back. This remarkable crowd of petty crims, the people who had been locked up in the bars that night for various criminal offences, from something simple through to murder. This wonderful swirling mass of people and their dodgy solicitors with them. One old guy who was so past it that he couldn't actually remember who he was representing, so he just gave up and gave the same spiel every morning, and the magistrate would remind him what their names were. His offsider was a fellow called Phil Roach, lovely old bloke, sort of. His offsider was, his law clerk was a bloke called Brian Alexander, and brief segue. Brian, if anyone watched Blue Murder, the original series, not that ghastly thing Seven did a couple of years ago, sorry. The original Blue Murder has a remarkable scene, which I think everyone who's seen it can't get out of their head, where the Nettie Smith character and a couple of detectives are on the back of a boat near the heads. And it's bobbing away nicely, and Nettie comes back, and law clerk Brian Alexander is standing there having a beer. They're all having a good blokey chat. And Nettie comes back and pulls a tarpaulin off this thing in the middle of the back of the boat, and it's an old early cooker cast iron stove, whereupon Nettie then attaches the law clerk to the stove quite firmly. Then they pick up the stove with the law clerk attached and throw it over the side and bid him farewell in something I won't say on live stream. And that was the last we see of Brian Alexander. It's probably not quite true, but Brian disappeared and has never been seen before. He was about to rat on the underworld to the coppers, and they found out about it, unsurprisingly. So in this remarkable place, all these weird people turning up, regularly this Ronnie Matthews would appear on the charge sheets. Ronnie would always arrive looking very, very unhappy having been arrested. Ronnie used to dress like a North Shore matron, but was built like a rugby league footballer. And he had the most very thin lips, as I recall, and a luxuriant red wig. And Ronnie was always being caught in St Peter's Lane, adjacent to the Horizon, offering services late at night. This was normally after he'd finished work at the Carousel Club. So you had this really interesting group of people waiting there when Juanita arrives. Now, the two ladies have given over the years a wild variety of stories. They've given them, some of them on oath as well, I might say. But the stories vary as to what they saw, what happened that morning. No one really knows. All we know is that Juanita went in and we didn't see her leaving. Shane Martin Simmons and Eddie Trigg were later charged. The police investigation kicked in fairly fast, within about 24 hours after she was obviously missing. And it didn't get anywhere at all. The bloke handling the investigation was a chap I got to know, and he said he did his best, but there seemed to be a lot of impediments thrown in his way, politicians, senior police officers and crims. So the investigation faltered, and no one at the Cross was talking at all. The only thing that came out of the investigation was, one, no one found Juanita. Two, Trigg and Martin Simmons were arrested for conspiring to abduct her, and they both went to jail for it. And that's the only thing that ever rose from it. There was a curious piece of evidence a couple of days later on the motorway out to Penrith. They found Juanita's handbag with her identification still in it, strewn on in the bushland. So all of a sudden the investigation moved from the Cross very quickly out to Penrith and subsequently to the lower Blue Mountains. I've always thought that this was a complete and utter furphy. The crooks have just thought it's a really, really good idea to distract the coppers, and it worked beautifully. But years later, nothing ever happened. No one's really arrested for the murder. We don't know what happened to her. Coming out of that strange morning at the Cross is an inquest in 1983 where the magistrate then criticised the police and said obviously there was a corrupt interference in the investigation. And that's pretty much on the money, but still they can't pinpoint who did it and what happened that morning. This is enter into the story all these bizarre rumours about what did happen, and we're still getting them. We'll get to that fairly shortly. For my money, and you've got to stump up on these things, the most likely person responsible for killing Juanita Nielsen, ultimately, obviously Frank Tiemann. He had everything to gain and very little to lose in the Cross of those days because he had the game sewn up. The $25,000 paid 5 weeks beforehand to Jimmy Anderson is compelling evidence, particularly when the nightclub owner didn't know what was going on and said, my nightclub wasn't for sale, who's this Jimmy Anderson bloke? So that, for me, is around about the right freight for a contract killing circa 1975, possibly almost generous. So I think Anderson masterminded, and the two gentlemen who were up at the Carousel at that stage were responsible for at least sequestering her. Who actually killed her? I think Craig would have no compunction whatsoever in shooting her. Not 1 ounce. Jimmy Anderson also is a man who liked to do his own dirty work. He was quite infamous briefly in 1970, where when he was running the Venus Room, a gentleman called Donnie the Glove Smith. No one ever knew why he was called the Glove. I tried to find out why, but yeah, it's called the Glove. He'd had some disagreement with Jimmy Anderson, so as Donnie was leaving the delightful Venus Room in the wee small hours of the morning, and by the way, the Venus Room at that stage had a number of fairly important detectives around town sitting there having a quiet free beer, Jimmy shoots him in the back twice, and Donnie dies in the gutter outside the Venus Room in Orwell Street, stone dead in the gutter. Jimmy is arrested, not surprisingly, for murder, and he's charged, and he gets bail and all that sort of stuff. And a couple of years later, in order to prosecute a serious crime in New South Wales, the Attorney General has to file a bill to proceed with it. Oddly enough, Jimmy didn't get a bill filed against him. He got a pat on the head and said, oh, sorry, we've decided it was self-defence, even the guy shot twice in the back. So Jimmy was having a fairly golden run up in the Cross. A couple of years later, when he decided to turn on Abe Saffron, and this is why their relationship was destroyed so comprehensively, Jimmy hires a hitman to go and kill Abe. The hitman is so concerned that killing Abe would be a really bad career move that he goes to tell Abe. Abe, in this very calm fashion, just gets upset with Jimmy, and they part. And that was the start of a series of events that saw Abe eventually going to jail and Jimmy becoming the prize informant for the National Crime Authority. and costing them more money than they've ever had with an informant ever before. He used to fly first class everywhere on the government tick. So for my money, Jimmy Anderson is a man who could kill cold-bloodedly, particularly if it's someone who's not going to fight back, which if Juanita Neilson was suitably trussed up, she would have been unable to fight back. I suspect that at some stage in the course of that day, she's been bundled out the back door of the lay girls into the back of a car and disappeared. Logistically, a couple of rumours are problematic. One popular rumour of the time, and this is the grisly part, I'll get it out of the way early, one popular rumour was that she was taken down to the kitchens, dismembered, and then pushed through a meat grinder, which is intriguing because one, the kitchen probably didn't have a meat grinder, and just the basics of criminal investigation, it sounds great and it's really grisly and lovely and gory, but dismembering a body isn't easy. It requires a degree of skill, and there's also a lot of fluids kicking around, so that just doesn't make any sense, but it's told with great relish by many people. One of the other rumours, and Brandy mentioned earlier the Hydro Majestic, one of the more intriguing rumours that in fact intrigued Channel 9's A Current Affair last year was she was bundled in the back of a car, she was driven along the motorway. For some reason, the dead Juanita managed to throw her bag out the window. Yeah, it's getting better. And with the assistance of a clairvoyant, I think at one stage, they think, ah yes, she's buried in the grounds of the Hydro Majestic under a tree.
That's just Channel 9 writing an underbelly series.
Yeah.
Like that's the script. They're like, hey, what if she comes up halfway through, throws her bag out in Penrith, there's a little bit of a struggle, then she's buried under a tree.
Great story.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Wrapped up.
Yeah,
Season
done.
1 done.
Didn't work. It was a package story.
Yeah.
I'll be kind. And then the other great popular rumour, of course, Sydney back in those days, the underworld dumping ground was either in Botany Bay, under the runway that was being constructed at the time, which generally it wasn't because it was already constructed, or in the sand dunes at Kurnell, this is where Sydney's underworld used to like to take their bodies that they really wanted to make sure no one got a look at. And a couple of years ago, while the desalination plant was being constructed, they found 3 sets of human bones, 2 disparate male and 1 female. I remember talking to one of the detectives out there because I was fascinated. At that stage I was writing a book on Christopher Flannery, who had been blithely murdering people and disappeared in 1985 as well without trace, with in part a similar cast. And the detective informed me, stone-faced, he wasn't very happy. He said, oh, we think it might be in an Aboriginal burial site. And I said, mate, there are reports of a bounty bar under the bones and one has got a black nylon sock on. How does that work? And so that relationship went down the toilet fairly fast after that. But they were able to confirm that the female bones weren't Juanita. So that excitement went away. Sadly, they also said it wasn't Christopher Flannery, so I was particularly disappointed. I thought we were getting a sort of 2-for-1 mystery solve on that all. And the 2 popular ones that I think work best of all are that she's either in the foundations of the Victoria Point development, that's that ghastly thing still hanging on the side. It's horrible, but it looks like it was well built. Or she's in a little railway arch, it looks like a railway arch to me nearby. Now, to check the theories, I spoke to the Institute of Civil Engineers, and they were very, very helpful because I thought, well, you put getting a body into a foundation before a concrete pour is going to be problematic. People tend to notice a person with a beehive. And the second point, again, just the brief grisly moment, as nature takes its course, would you end up getting saggy bits in the foundations? There's a body in the foundations. Does it affect the structural integrity? And the architects, the engineers were fantastic. They said, no, there are certain spots, one, that the concrete will just flow into that you probably couldn't see comfortably. I thought, oh, that's good. And secondly, it is highly unlikely if they had good quality concrete, which the fact that the thing's still there must have been, is that it wouldn't damage it at all. The structural integrity of the building wouldn't be maintained. So that theory still holds a lot of credit. And one of the reasons I like this and the other theory is if you've got a dead body, it is problematic to drive it round Sydney in the back of a car. I know that the poor old Arthur King had done a couple of laps of Sydney, but if there's a dead body in the back of the car, chances are, and if you're looking a bit shifty, you might get pulled over by a zealous member of the Highway Patrol who will want to look in the boot, and it's going to be hard to explain. So that theory, the foundations theory, has a lot of credit. The second theory is one of my favourites, is that if you walk down the Butler steps of Victoria Street down to Brougham Street, if you look to your right as you're walking down the stairs, there's the foundations for Victoria Street, which appear to be like Victorian train arches. And underneath it is a very barren area. But in the middle of that barren area, there's a small depression. And that small depression is normally a giveaway that there's something structurally different in the soil. This is wishful thinking on my part, by the way. And there's a tiny patch of vegetation there and nowhere else. And the only reason I'm fascinated by that is I had a couple of sources years ago came to me and said, this is where the body is. Now, we haven't got there with ground penetrating radar. A few of us managed to do something similar in Adelaide a couple of years ago with the Beaumont kids and didn't find anything. So the excavation budget in television isn't quite what it used to be. So that's my favourite location.
So this is like, I'm going to give him a chance to have a sip because I'm about to like push the latest news. He said this last week and I was like, we just need to cut some chains down, let's go into the viaducts, let's just dig that patch of dirt up. I was all for it. I was rallied. I almost had the audience then with me. We were going to do it then.
You were going to Aldi to get the ground penetrating
radar. Yeah, it's a special at Aldi at the moment. But I was like convinced. I was like, that is it. She's dead. She's laying there. She's maybe chopped up, but like, let's do it. Today, Duncan walks in casually. And he's like, hey, I've just got a little bit of news. This is like probably the closest, other than the fact that I got excited when we renovated here that I thought she was hidden in our well.
Ah, yes.
And I was like, she's there. And then when they did the King's Cross distillery, they found some bones when they were excavating that. And I was like, she's definitely there again. I seem to just get excited at the vague hint of a hidden body. I don't even need to see bones. But Duncan, please. I don't know if I'm building this up, but I'm really excited by it.
Oh, that's a good build-up. No, King's Cross is wonderful. The stories, the whispers you hear are just fantastic. And some of them, and particularly in my business as a journalist, you hear so many wonderful stories and you think, oh yeah, lovely, but it doesn't work. So and a lot of people who approach you, you think, oh, 95% of what they tell me is crap, but you can't say no because the 5% is gold. And a couple of days ago, a well-known King's Cross identity, who is utterly reputable and a very smart human being, someone would trust, rang me and said, oh mate, I can't talk to you on the phone about this, and I don't want to commit it to an email, but can we go and have a glass of wine? There's something about Juanita you need to know. And this is the point that, like, because of live stream, there will be no specifics mentioned. But yeah. Heaven forbid, no. Yeah. And the story he told me is compelling. There is a building somewhere in the nearby area which was, shall we say, run down. Yeah. Seriously run down. It's bought by a property developer, not unsurprisingly. And an honourable property developer, I hasten to add, not like the other team. The property developer and his architect are walking through the new acquisition. They've got the plans from the original building. They're looking at it and they're thinking, they're in one of the rooms and it's sort of, this room is the wrong size. This room should be a lot bigger. The plan says it's bigger, yet here we are in this little tiny miserable room. So there's a bit of head scratching and a couple of the builders are with them. They're all thinking, what do we do next? So they start tapping on the walls, just very old fashioned, with their thumb, finger. Tap, tap, tap. You know, solid, 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 clunk. And then you get the echo. So the bloke at that stage doesn't care. He said, he calls two blokes in and says, just tear the bloody wall down. So these two guys go hard at it. There's gyprock and plywood flying left, right and centre. And eventually they pull it out of the way. And what is revealed is a separate room. And in the middle of that room, there is absolutely nothing. There's nothing in the room whatsoever. It's dark, there are no lights, there's no nothing, apart from a power cord plugged into the wall, leading to an industrial-size deep freeze. Circa about 70s. Right? Not your Melly's Tucker box, 5 kilos. This is the wrong term. This is a full-sized refrigerator you'd see in the back of a restaurant. Big enough to put a body on, one would suggest. And the property developer, who's an astute sort of fellow, looks at that and says, don't open it. then when the architect is gone, he tells a couple of his builders to unplug it, don't open it, and get rid of it. And no one knows what was inside. So these blokes carry out this massive chest freezer and get rid of it. We don't know where. We're hoping to find out, however. No one's opened it.
And like, as Duncan was saying before, with the small bit of research he's done, those, let's just call them body freezers, can run on a power source indefinitely for a long amount of time. Even if there was a short amount of like a power surge or anything like that, it would boot right back up. Keeping a body deep freeze, like again, I'm assuming that there's a body in there. It would nullify any smell, it would make sure that it was kept contained. It's also in a false room, so that's already highlighting some weirdness.
Seriously weird.
But like, is that not where she is, right? And so essentially you said to me that they went to a tip and buried that.
They took them straight to a tip, throw it into the landfill, and you know, if you wander around a tip, as I have on occasions, you wander and just drop it in the landfill, and they just drive it into the ground. So, you know, it could have a rugby field on top of it by now. I've got to find out where.
Oh, that's so annoying.
And on a grisly note, they probably wouldn't have defrosted before it was compacted.
That's even more annoying.
Sorry about that.
Right, so now we've got, I actually just want to put this out there because I was like, we've solved it. Obviously, we haven't yet, but like that's what I think solved it. We've now got 3 theories. I'm just going to get a show of hands. Sorry for the live stream people, you won't get involved in this. But we've got who thinks that she's buried out in Penrith at the Hydro Majestic. Put your hands up.
No.
No. The second one was dumped out in the harbour or something like that. No.
No.
Chopped up and put in the meat grinder.
Nah.
No. Buried under the viaducts. I'm halfway there. Like, like if I can't have the deep freezer, I'm still going to do that one.
It's elegant.
It's elegant. Like it's symbolic.
Well, it's 200 metres from door to door.
This is the other thing that Duncan was saying to me when we were first talking about it, is the idea of just moving something around and having no one in King's Cross see it. Or anywhere you went. Like if you're carrying a dead body, even if it's chopped up or moved, you've got to get it out of the back door. You've got to put it in a boot without anyone actually witnessing it, and we've got to flag at the same time. The cross isn't like it is now then, it was busy. Like there's people in laneways doing whatever the fuck they want. So I find that quite difficult.
And more coppers per square foot than anywhere. Uniform coppers, detectives everywhere. Some looking to make some money somewhere else, and the rest of them thinking to want to go and arrest somebody. And back in those days, certainly in 1980, your task in life was to walk on and talk to people. It could be sociable. You also might want to lock them up. Yeah. So, yeah, walking through the cross with a carpet roll, perhaps, and a dead body in it would attract attention.
Yeah, and now, the ice chest, who vibes that? Yes, yes. Yeah. The building that I know, because I know what it is, live stream, it's very close to what is now the Empire. So I'm 100% feeling like it was that. But let's close it now. We'll go around and we'll put some cards on everyone's tables. You can ask some questions. Ask questions from anything. You can ask questions about various different clubs and stuff like that. You can ask questions about where certain people are. Be creative, because they're actually the question and answer session last week was really, really good because people asked some very intense questions. So have a thought, and now's the time to order more drinks, and we'll get the cards out to you. Enjoy.
Thank you.
All right, while we listen to the dulcet tones of this playlist that seems very chilled out, we're going to be a little bit more like liberal with this one. You can obviously get and order drinks during this moment. Has everyone got their questions in? Did anyone want to ask any questions? Anyone on the live stream want to ask any questions? Haha, you missed your chance. I don't know how it works, so we're just not giving them that option.
Marie says she knows too much.
Marie. Thank you, Marie, for those playing at home. Which is Marie, she's playing at home. Duncan, did you want to go?
Oh, wander back.
Okay. So, now that it's like essentially everyone's questions are about the body in the freezer, which is fair, and we'll answer them all because they all ask a various different thing. However, last week we did talk about a couple of things that I said that we flagged throughout the chat. You guys we didn't really touch on it, but bottoms up bar, please, just for the people, describe bottoms up bar and where it was.
The bottoms up bar was something that the first time I walked in there, I thought, good God.
It was a sophisticated cocktail.
Well, there was a lot of tales and a lot of other things. If I could put it that way.
Tales.
Yeah, anyway, the bottom up bar was part of the Rex Hotel. The apartments that you see in the Rex now are quite genteel. Back until they built them and knocked the old joint down, the Rex started out, it's like so many things in King's Cross, it started out as a very stylish hotel. And then it wasn't. Big, huge places. You can see from the Rex, it's actually quite a large site. As you got to the front door, and I remember I first went there seriously in, January 1980 as a copper, and it had this remarkable confluence of people, very much like the Cross. To one side there was the public bar, which had pool tables, people with enormous tattoos. Mullets were very fashionable. Most of them had either a gun or a knife on them, and almost all of them had formed for very serious crimes. Quite a few of them shouldn't have been walking around. We had warrants to arrest them, so we did. And you'd walk into the bar, and it was in one of those joints, you walk in, and the first thing you'd walk in, coppers have a habit, you just can't get out of it, even years later. You walk in, stand in the doorway, look around. The bar goes dead quiet. The bottoms up bar was one of the few bars you could actually do that and no one would pay any attention to you. They just didn't care. So you'd walk through and you'd go and have a chat to them as what the business was and those that needed to be arrested were and all that sort of stuff. Attached to the public bar outside, a lovely outdoor eating area. You'll see some lovely pictures of the Rex back in, I think, the late 60s, early 70s. People eating outside, which in Sydney was pretty unusual because councils weren't too keen on outdoor dining. They thought it was a bit too European.
Well, they were also the first place in Australia that did alfresco dining as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Rex. Ironically, the Rex now, I think they went through 2 years in order to get those 2 tables outside. Yeah. 3 years to get 2 tables outside.
One of them approved before COVID.
Yeah, just one table. Now anyone can put a table on the street and be good. So
the restaurant was quite glamorous, and you had the ruffians next door. You had well-to-do people, the old locals, people coming up from Double Bay, and it was run by, I can't remember the bloke's name, but the floor manager was a guy for a lot of years was called Bill Vandenberg, and Bill eventually ended up going to jail for life for murdering hotelier Megan Kalajic. And her husband also went in for employing him. It's a really messy King's Cross story where the plot to kill Megan, this wife of the well-to-do Manly hotelier, is plotted in the Rex Hotel. The hitman is hired in the Rex Hotel. The plan goes slightly astray and the hitman is terrorised by a gunman in the Harry Seidler apartments in Billiard Avenue. And if you happen to live or go down there, you'll see the open garages to one side. There is, in fact, 2 bullet holes. I don't know. I went down there one day just for a look. So that was this lovely restaurant. If you walked into the main entrance of the hotel, which had the entrance to the accommodation upstairs, you then take a little left past the 2 large Maori bouncers, who were very friendly, and you walk into the bottoms up bar, which is like a scene from a movie that you really don't want to see twice. Actually, maybe 3 times. A big sort of elliptical bar, barman stocked up inside, and every everything. It takes the breath away. Basically, RSL carpet, sticky, of course. This remarkable selection of old drunks, barflies, young male prostitutes, drag queens, just sitting there. And on Thursday nights, I remember this quite vividly because you'd go to dinner at the Clay Street Bistro and then walk across for a roadie at the Rex and walk into the Bottoms Up bar. And there were strippers on the bar top working while the bar was going flat strap.
Gotta go.
Yeah, the place was just completely off its face. You could buy anything you wanted there. And some things you didn't want, and you'd probably catch a lot of things that you didn't want either. It was extraordinary, absolutely bloody extraordinary, and all very calm, and people would smile at you. And there'd be old blokes, you'd walk in at 11 o'clock at night, there'd be a bloke there since it opened at 10 a.m. and just quietly sipping his schooner, watching all the wackos. It was a wonderful place, absolutely wonderful.
I actually wish I went to the Bottoms Up bar. But the next one I wanted to talk about was obviously the Venus Lounge.
The Venus Room. Originally opened as a stylish cocktail bar, which Abe soon found out, of course, it didn't work. So it started.
Right.
Yeah.
He's right.
Yeah. It started life as his first strip club, the Staccato Club, and it was in his entrepreneurial phase when he was bringing out Sinatra and other great acts from the US, and he went to Las Vegas once. And he was fascinated by the number of dancers on stage wearing pasties and bugger all else. And he thought, oh, this is really intriguing. So Abe brought the art of striptease back to Australia. Of course, we were moderately horrified by it all, so the pasties had to be reasonably substantial. And they had to wear a G-string without too much cheek showing.
How does that happen? How do you wear a G-string and not have too much cheek? Asking for a friend.
Yeah, you move carefully.
Yeah, you move carefully. Duncan McNab. Where actually was Venus Lounge? Because this is the thing that I always struggle with when people talk about old places in King's Cross, is that everyone just says a name and everyone goes, oh. But then you're like, okay, where was that?
32 Oral Street, which if you walked or is it 6 right now? If you get to the Roosevelt,
you've gone too far.
No, you walk down the hill towards Victoria Street, and it was the next corner. And I think there's a backpacker thing. Yeah. Well, the Venus Club room was downstairs. Was the bar, which with the famous sausage roll, and every ne'er-do-well in Christendom was parked there.
Oh, actual sausage roll. I was like, what was the famous sausage roll?
Would you care for that? There was a lot of sausage rolling upstairs because. If you went round if you bumped into someone
someone's suddenly becoming very, very flighty.
Well, if you bumped into someone you liked in the bar, you
got the famous sausage roll.
You can go upstairs for the sausage roll. Alternately, you could also go upstairs and just pick at random from the number of people who were in. Conveniently, it's now a backpackers hostel because it had lots of small rooms and plumbing.
Good.
Ensuite, not an ensuite bathroom, but it had an ensuite hand basin, which was very helpful.
How modern.
Yeah.
All right, so does anyone have any questions regarding venues in King's Cross before we move on? No? Good. Everyone's well informed, it seems. Can you tell us a few yarns about Kellett Street? This person has just moved in and wants to hear so many stories. P.S. Somehow it's still fucking crazy, even in lockdown. Sister, I hear you. Our back door opens onto Kellett Lane, and that is an experience that
Kellett's a remarkable street. It's so pretty. Some of those, I lived there briefly on one of the large, 3-story terraces with the lofts and all this sort of stuff. The first part of Kellett Street was always brothels. I found out that by accident when we had stopped there one day and our boss went in and for 15 minutes we thought, oh, I wonder what he's doing in there, talking to an informant? We didn't realise. Then we thought, oh, maybe he's getting a hand job. And then we realised he was actually picking up money.
So many endings to that story that I was happy with.
Yeah, well, was happy and always happy.
Yeah, cool.
With a sausage roll.
Yeah. Dear old thing that he was. But if you wander around into the straight section, well, on the corner was Natalino's, which was a very chic restaurant, which is now Silly Tart or something or other.
It's a very good breakfast place.
It's a great breakfast place. Natalino's is great. You could actually go to Natalino's at 1 o'clock in the morning, as I recall. Round the corner from that, there was Dean's Cafe, which was quite famous in the 70s and 80s because it opened late, great food, nice people. On the other side of the road, a bit number 46 to 52, was a brothel, and I suspect still might be, but they knocked down the wall between the two so you could easily get between them. What was curious, and it always fascinated me when people were saying, oh, the cross is full of these crooks running brothels. I did a real estate search on the property, and it turned out to be owned by a very well-known Sydney restaurateur of absolutely genteel background, who just ran it with sitting tenants.
Who was it?
I can't possibly comment. So it was that wonderful mix of some great restaurants on the corner. I think it was Lime and Lemongrass, and I think it's being renovated again. That beautiful restaurants, stylish dining, and brothels. Great, lovely part of town, really.
Yeah, I actually really love this. 2 martinis deep. This is the best way that you get conversations with Duncan, and if you ever get a chance to find him here, go up and talk to him, because there are some amazing stories that he will not tell you on live stream. But this man has seen and heard a lot of things. One of the most famous stories about Kellett Street, though, is the battle for Kellett Street, which is Kate Lee and Tilly Devine's group.
I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah, this is we often, all of our drinks here at Dulcie's, all of our signatures, we name after the people and places that changed Sydney's culture. And we did a Kellett Street sour, which was a New York sour. For anyone who has ever had a New York sour, you stain the top of it with a red wine. The reason we did that was because Kellett Street had this massive battle where Kate Lee's boys and Tilly Devine's boys faced off against each other. And the newspaper article that we read said the streets ran literally red with blood. Now I laughed at that. I was like, everyone uses that phrase, that's just extrapolation. You see the crime photos, and it's Kellett Street with bitumen, which one of my staff pointed out they didn't have bitumen at that stage. And it was literal blood red stained running the streets. So it looked like it was just a sea of blood. And essentially that was without guns, and it was all knives and razors.
Razors. Literally. One of the most, knives are upsetting, guns are particularly upsetting if someone points them at you, but some people are lousy shots. Knives equally as problematic, but razors just have that extra edge of terror.
It's actually really fucked up.
Yeah, seriously.
But I remember doing a tour of Alcatraz in San Fran, and one of the guys was like, oh my God, Al Capone, the world's most dangerous criminal at that time, he would have been the worst. And the tour guide actually was like, well, actually in the 20s, the two worst underlords were 2 women in Sydney who never had to deal with anything with their hands. He was like, Al Capone had guns, Kate Lee and Tilly Devine had a bunch of men who were willing to take a razor to anyone's face, girl or boy.
Yeah, and razors bring with them that other thing. They just bring with them a sound.
Never heard that sound, Duncan. But
it's quite distinctive. Yeah, and that's what's so chilling about them. Around about the same time, I think there were battles not only through East Sydney, but even dear old Woolmer Avenue, which is now terribly, terribly well to do. They were brawling each other in the lanes where the night carts used to be. You'll see those little narrow laneways that we still have some of, which is basically where the bits and pieces from the backyard were put on a bloke's shoulder, and he carried them out to the dunny truck.
Oh. Neither the razors nor the
horrible. I did forget something. Kellett Street was also home to one of the biggest casinos that we didn't have. There was a casino we didn't have in Minton House upstairs, which is Minton House is the place on the corner. Yeah. And acquaintance of mine who still ran, is a lovely man. He ran the big casino on the top floor, but round the corner from him, one of the large old terraces, was a casino run by a bloke just nicknamed the Doctor. And he was an interesting fellow. And interesting enough, when I was at the Copper, my workmate's wife used to run it. And
did she get a good card, or?
No, but we tried to keep church and state separate. But I remember she offered one day. She said, you guys need some suits. And I thought, oh yeah, I love a good suit. You come into the club, we'll get you fitted out, and we'll bring it back shortly. But no, I don't think we want to do that. But the better shoplifting gangs would go there at night, take your measurements, whip down to often Tony Yielding Squire shop in Double Bay, and plunder it. It's great.
All right.
I hasten to add, we said no, that's not a really good idea.
That would have been a great story though. Where's this suit from? It was stolen. I'm also a detective. Where would you hide a body now? Again, asking for a friend, wink wink.
Look, I like burial at sea.
How far out?
Oh, not far. It's not a matter of how far out, it's a matter of the waiting.
All right, so I'm going to be the devil's advocate. How much weight? Is there a ratio?
Well, there are two things you need to do. One, you make sure that the body has holes in it so it sinks, so it doesn't swell up.
Good point.
Roger Rogerson should have known better, but obviously forgot. Lazy.
I feel like we need to do a whole one of these nights on Roger Rogerson.
And then just as a curious segue that explains this, and by the way, it's grisly, so please bear with me. When Sally Ann Huckstep, who most of you probably heard of, the woman who actually bought Roger Rogerson undone years ago, she was very bloody brave. She was fucked up but brave. When she was found dumped in Centennial Park, floating in Busby's Pond.
Of all the places, I don't think Busby's Pond is where I'd sink a body.
Yeah, well, they did. Well, that's where the story comes in.
Don't do it in a pond.
Yeah. Neddy Smith allegedly runs into the pub that he allegedly owned in Waterloo, the Iron Duke, and speaks to the then manager, who was allegedly a former homicide squad detective. Neddy runs in the morning Sally Ann's found, before she's found. And the bloke said, doing what publicans always do, just hosing the concrete for reasons I can't even fathom. And Neddy says, you're an ex-copper. You know what, bad bodies? Yeah. What do you do? Do bodies float up if you drop them in? No. I said, mate, you've got to stab them a couple of times and they'll sink if you weight them down properly. And Neddy thinks, oh, shit, and runs out the door. He's got scratches all over him. And then the detective is listening to the ABC News at 7:45 a.m. And first report of a body being found in Busby's Pond, floating. And he thinks, Neddy, oh, it's Sally Ann. Oh, Jesus.
Silly boy, should have stabbed her first. Now we know.
That's the grisly part. Then you weight them down so they sink.
Yeah, but you don't do it. Okay, but don't do it in a pond. Make sure they're weighted down. Make holes in the body.
Yeah, bottom line is bodies are really hard to get rid of. Crime is interesting. There are two great challenges of a criminal. One, getting rid of a body, or secondly, getting rid of the proceeds of crime. Both are problematic.
So this is where I'm going to divulge a bit about myself, and I hope no one in my family is watching the live stream. My grandfather worked in concreting, and while my grandfather was really by the book, we all used to joke that his back was so sore because of the crucifix he carried. My grandmother, on the other hand, used to love the idea that she was married to an Italian concreter, and every time she had a rental dispute with one of the tenants, she would just open the boot of the car to 2 bags of cement. She told me a story about friends who had cemented people, nothing to do with my family, but she heard this story about someone in Canberra who had cemented someone into a piece of cement. And when they went to demolish the building about 15 years ago, they cracked it open, and the body didn't disintegrate at the same rate that it normally would if you didn't get
No, because the oxygen, roughly, there's no oxygen.
Well, that's the thing. I feel like
it's a bit like being mummified.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other popular way, and this is something I'd forgotten, which it's only an anecdotal story. I can't prove it, but there was a funeral director in Newtown in not in King Street. There was a funeral director in Newtown who was always famous for jokes about him, how the coffin's a bit heavier on the way to the crematorium. And the running joke around it was, oh mate, you probably need 4 pallbearers, not 2 for this one.
Is that just because people are doubling up in the coffins?
Yeah, doubling up, or preferably doubling up and taking it to the crematorium, in which case there's no evidence.
Well, that's how I would do it. I would just burn. Anyway, we don't need to continue further about this, because we're just all getting really macabre.
It wasn't white lady funerals, I hasten to add.
Could you imagine though? They would be the best ones. That's who I want to do it. All right, more about the kidnappers. How were they caught? Now, I feel like, I don't know what this is in relation to, but I feel like this was the failed kidnap attempt for Juanita, and they were tried, correct me if I'm wrong with this question, that they were caught and put to jail for conspiring.
I think they eventually admitted to it.
Was that right? Yeah. All right. Yeah. Cool.
I'm a bit rusty on it, but I think the investigation got to the point where they had to arrest somebody, and they found David Farrell, Juanita's partner at the time, recognised them because the failed attempt on I think the 30th of June or something or other, these two clowns tap on the door. They're both quite distinctive. He remembers them, they give him some puerile excuse and then run off. You know, where's Juanita? We've come for a chat. And they, or say it's something pretty dumb. I mean, these guys weren't master criminals. And then they run off. So they become suspects fairly quickly because we have that incident. Then we have the next step, which is who was around the carousel at the time? Ah, you.
So it's just seriously.
I think that's how it happened, yeah. And at some stage, I could be completely wrong, but I think they both pleaded guilty as well. So,
That's
you know, it might be a question of sacrificial lambs.
Yeah, well, we know about those.
Guilty lambs, but sacrifices nevertheless.
Where is the developer guy now?
Oh, Frank's been dead for years. Frank died of natural causes. Frank Tiemann, I'm sorry, died of natural causes years ago. As a curiosity, his mistress lived in, I think, the end terrace before the staircase that I once ran up and down a lot. When you get down to the end of Victoria, yeah, not
I'm
anymore.
very aware of that same
That's
same problem.
I remember years ago. I think, oh God, these days I look at it and think I'll just take a cab. The very last terrace there, from memory, it actually has windows overlooking the staircase.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
gorgeous. And she was ensconced in an apartment there most of her life. She died quite recently ago, without telling anyone the stories that she may or may not have known.
I was like, she's allowed to die alone.
No,
She doesn't have to
sorry.
tell you when she's dead.
That was a dramatic pause.
Yeah, I was like, whoa. One thing that I don't think we've really touched on is the power of Juanita's campaign with Jack Mundy to green ban the development of Victoria Street. I think we very quickly skimmed over it.
Yep.
But the power of that is actually quite interesting. And since the powerhouse has had green ban slammed on it, does everyone know what a green ban is?
Yep. Yes.
For those at the back who don't, can you quickly explain a green ban?
Back in those days, the Builders Labourers Federation was quite an honourable organisation. Fiery, very left-wing. Mundy was a communist, which makes his relationship with Juanita even more fascinating. I mean, you can't get more disparate than a pimple matronly family to a rough and tumble bloke, I think probably from around Balmain or something or other, who got his hands dirty brawling over these things. So the green bans, the developers wanted to flatten as much as possible, and with the asset of having Bob Askin as the Premier, that wasn't terribly complicated. Laws could get shoved to one side, provided his mates made a quid, who cared? Sydney was also rapaciously changing. We thought this big, almost a New York-style city. Our past wasn't going to be preserved. And Mundy and the green bans is all about preserving that past, preserving the rocks for what it is. That cradle of the first European civilized settlement in Australia. The cross, Victoria Street, I mean, you look at Victoria Street now and if you close your eyes, it's still one of the most beautiful streets in the city.
Yeah.
You just have to block out the ghastly blonde brick apartment buildings. Pretend they're not there and just imagine this glorious sweep of a place.
I'm going to repost I think the prospectus plans of what they were proposing for Victoria Street on our social medias the next couple of days. It's ludicrous. It's this weird hybrid of, like, if you imagine what's there now with the Three Ugly Sisters, I think you times that by 2 with height,
Yep.
and you run it consistently all the way along Victoria Street, and that's what they were planning. It's disgusting.
Yeah. They saw it as a huge cash cow. As I said earlier, the ROA was about to finally turn up and was part of Neville Rand's election campaign, 76, 77, to have the Cross have a train station. Pure an oddity, Abe Saffron made more money out of the train station than he did out of anything else, because he had a lease on the property where the train station is now. And
The King's Cross Theatre.
yeah, the King's Cross, the train. They actually, that sort of grotty-looking 60s building, and the train station is under. If you look at it, you don't want to look up. It's not
The
pretty.
weird backpack, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, above that there was a brothel and a casino.
They sold that to Transport New South Wales as a side note.
They did, and Abe had a lease on it, and I think they had to pay him something like $9 or $10 million.
Yeah, he destroyed.
He's very happy. Yeah.
When did they discover the secret room in this building that we won't mention on the live stream, which we're not turning off?
The room was, well, the timeline's a bit weird. Shall we say it was recently, but not in the last couple of years. It was a few years back. I had to put the timeline together based on the bits and pieces, the disparate bits of information. If you're investigating a crime, or telling a story for that matter, the critical part is to put the chronology together, and my information was a little bit, not inaccurate, not precise. So I did some research over the weekend and I've got the timeline sorted out. So I would suggest it was probably about 5 or 6 years ago.
Which is just when the lockouts came into, which is
Yeah, that's a good,
exactly
interesting point.
why that building suddenly
What
lost a
building?
reason to. I don't know what building. What is the rationale for keeping a body in a freezer? Surely disposing of the evidence is more than the norm. I'm going to answer this really quickly. The body's frozen, it can't make any smells, and if you put a wall up and you think you're going to own that building until you die, no one asks any questions.
That's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just what I would do. Duncan.
That's troubling.
Sorry.
Who's paying for the electricity?
Obviously the person who owns the building. Because if he's hiding a secret, he's actually really okay with paying that electricity.
Who owns the building?
I'm not sure who owned what building you're talking about. It could have been any building.
This is where it gets murky, not for live stream.
Yeah, we're definitely not on live stream.
The investigation is in progress.
Duncan, have you had the chance to meet the two guys working on the property development where this freezer was located?
No, I only got the information on Friday night, and investigations are underway.
Yeah, so this is very new. Anyway, any more questions before we close the forum? Yes, Ben, bring it down. Everyone, this is Ben.
Hello, Ben.
Don't do that.
Is there a barrel involved?
Yeah. Pigs make very short work of a body. Has this been considered?
No, it hasn't, because... Oh, I hope not. Actually, the closest commercial piggery was once run by a former Prime Minister, but that's another story.
All right, next question. Yes.
I'd like to this is for you. What made you choose this venue and go into this sort of bar?
What made me choose the old Stripperama venue to open a cocktail bar? That's for the live stream. It was cheap. I'd always wanted to open a bar that could have been about 200 people big. I wanted to open a restaurant, that's where I came from. I wanted to open a big cabaret room, which one day hopefully I'll do, which will be a dinner restaurant, and it's all the things that Abe probably did when he did the Roosevelt. But essentially everyone I ever spoke to was like, make it small, make it small, make it smaller. And then we found this space. So essentially lockdowns happened, and this was the first casualty of lockout. Show of hands, who knew this venue before? Don't be ashamed. Of course you did. So only one? You're all liars. Oh, 2, 3, 4, 5. Live stream, Marie definitely did.
Maybe they can't remember.
Hands up.
Yeah. This was filth. Like, I think I tried to describe it a little bit more sweeter when we first opened, but now I'm 2 martinis deep. I'm happy to say that this was awful. Like, talking to my landlords now, they've owned this building for about 60 years through the family. They reckon when Stripperama was at its heyday, so I think they say from 2005 onwards, they didn't get access to the building at all. They weren't allowed any keys. They were told in no uncertain terms if you came down, you would be shown off the premise in more ways than you would hope to. Upstairs was an illegal brothel. The girls were kept here, basically fed heroin. I came down with my brother and watched, they were on a Bucks party, and I was, I think, 14 at the time, and it was the only place that I could get into in the Cross. That says a lot. And I came down and I watched what I thought was a woman dragging her hair across the stage for about 45 minutes. And then everyone else in the party proceeded to, well, not our party, but whoever was here, proceeded to engage in a live sex show with this woman, which is to show you how dark it was. Like, I'm not saying this in a celebrationary sense of stuff. Our landlord said every month there would be an average of 3 girls that would be dead and dumped in the back laneway. the cross, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, was not a fun place to be at that stage, just before lockouts. When we talk about lockouts, I used to be of the, like, it's fucked what the city did, and it's fucked what the state government did. The reality was that we never really saw what was happening. It was past the days of the well-adjusted criminals and the Abe Saffrons and the guys who did it well. You then just had cowboys that came in and did whatever the fuck they wanted and didn't care. So when we did renovations, we went into, there's a crawl space in our fire escape, which you can only reach by a 4-metre ladder. And we went up and there was probably about 30 years worth of heroin needles and empty VB cans that you can date. All stored up there like a weird little crawl space. And it just goes to show what this area was and the desperation. There's a few scribblings on the walls in the back room of like, no more dragons for Corona and things like that, which just show the kind of crazy desperation. There's a venue across the street that we were talking to a landlord recently, and he was saying that there's stuff written on the back walls about various clients and stuff that's crazy. I think King's Cross needed some kind of shake-up. I don't know if a full lockdown was really regarded as necessary, but I feel lucky to be part of the new guard of people coming in. And ever since we've come down, it may have been because it was cheap. And I always really loved King's Cross. It's always been my first memory of Sydney was seeing the Coke sign as a child. But I have a huge affinity for this area and I love it. And that was one of the reasons why I was so excited to come down and open an all-Australian spirits bar in the middle of the Cross, which is where everyone in Australia knows where it is. And I can't wait for to be a new King's Cross. There's been about 5 lifetimes that the Cross has lived through, and they're all very distinct, and they all have very different people that helm the change. And I think we're about to enter into a new version of the Cross, which hopefully doesn't lose the brothels in Kellett Streets or the strippers or the bars like this or like froth or whatever it is. I hope we all have equal breath to grow and live, because I think this area is cool. Like, it's a red light district. It's a nighttime precinct, and it's less about the residents who want to raise a family here and more about the identities. And that doesn't mean nighttime venues, it means the people who have lived here for generations and who will be shit-faced and come to the door every Sunday and tell me that their name's Champagne and they used to dance here. She's real. She is. They'll tell you these amazing stories, and they are able to recount the same names that Duncan says in a different way. And then there's also the people who have lived in the Macleay Regis for the last 50 years of their life, and they'll tell you another story. And that's what, like, I think now, retrospectively, I can say, I love this place because I was able to, I hope, become part of history in this area. And this is probably the easiest place in Australia to become part of the most favoured part of history. Everyone will always talk about King's Cross. Yeah, thank you. Hopefully Duncan talks about Dulcie's in another 30 years when they shake a martini in front of him and they're like, hey.
I may shake it myself by that stage.
Any other questions? Yes.
Duncan, who do you think might be responsible for Christopher Dale Flannery's disappearance?
Oh, I can tell you quite happily.
Let's quickly recount that question because otherwise no one will hear it. Who do you think is responsible for Christopher Dale Flannery's
disappeared in May 1985. He was standing outside the Connaught the Connaught Apartments in back of Hyde Park. His Valiant wouldn't start. What a surprise. He gets a cab, he goes to the airport. He's last seen leaving the airport without catching a plane. London to a brick, an old expression from King's Cross times. He was caught, Roger Rogerson and Neddy Smith took him, killed him and dropped him in a barrel. I've tried to interview the gentleman who was apparently on the end of the barrel, and he flatly refuses to discuss it with me. He's quite upset that I asked him the question, but yeah, I think they killed him either in the car that he was inveigled into at the TAA terminal, No, whatever it's
What
called.
does that mean?
Oh, TAA, the Qantas Domestic Terminal. Oh, hello. There's a lovely scene in Bluebird, which I think is actually pretty on the money, where Nettie swaggers into the TAA terminal where Chris is hiring a car, which he used to hire cars out there all the time. For some reason, he would pass William Street, he'd go to the airport. Nettie swaggers in and says, "Oh, hello, mate, Roger wants to have a talk to you." So Flannery, somewhat unwillingly, goes outside, hops in the back of the car, and that's the last we see of Christopher. I'm told by a couple of people, I think it's reasonably good, that having shot him, they then took him for a ride down to somewhere back into Bankstown or something or other on the Cooks River. They've inserted him into a large barrel which formerly had olive oil, and they've taken him for a ride, suitably weighted down, I hasten to add, taken him out into Botany Bay and rolled the barrel into the drink. And that's the end of Christopher. Reports that he was being seen in Rio de Janeiro are not accurate. He died like Juanita at a very convenient moment.
He's definitely not alive and well and living in Rio. Anyone else before we close the questions?
Oh, one small Dawn thing.
Yeah, actually, let's talk about Donna Dawn, because I love her.
One thing I just got to share with you, when I was interviewing Abe, and he's absolute, sorry, I've said before, my last glimpse of Abe, I saw him when he was in the hospital just about to die, but a couple of months beforehand I'd been to his birthday party, and I wandered in, and it was this wonderful selection of cross people, lawyers, a couple of judges, a couple of retired politicians, the drag queens. I walked into his place in Burke Street, and Abe's current partner said, "Oh, the drag queens are all at the back, love, near the air conditioning. It's too bloody hot."
Always so.
So they were keeping their makeup in place. And in Abe's office, and Abe had this gigantic desk with a huge chair, and he was only about this tall, you know. And he's sitting in this chair, and sitting on his lap is Carlotta, running her hands through what remained of his hair. And Abe was looking at me thinking, "Get me out of here." But in our conversations, he said, "You know, the only person who really scared me up at the cross was Dawn O'Donnell."
Fuck yeah.
She was terrifying. Because she, apparently, according to Abe, she just had no... There's a line you cross. Dawn didn't know where the line was. She just marched across it because it suited her.
I've actually heard this. A couple of people that I know have had interactions with Dawn, and she was... Watch Crocodile Dundee. Like, that's all I can say. She was incredible, and I think we owe, like, if anything from this conversation that you come out with today, how's the best way to say this? Hemingway said, if you want to know about a culture, don't go to its institutions and national monuments, go to its bars. That's a really nice way to say there are people who built cities and towns and cultures that aren't to be written in the history books in a polite way. And I think the things that Duncan says tonight and the other stories that he tells shows that there are people out there that have done so much for our city, Sydney, and I'll make it just about Sydney, that we'll never be proud enough to tell for what they did and how they did it, to tell kids and to tell the next generation growing up. And I think that that's really important, is that we understand the balance between the people who risked grand juries and charges to earn a buck, but who changed the way that we see the city.
Yeah, Dawn was the consummate opportunist. Dawn could see a buck in everything. I was just chatting a bit earlier. There's a couple of terrace houses in Liverpool Street opposite the hotel now called the East Village. And there's the stylish ones, and there are a couple of the old bald-faced terraces in which there might be a red light glowing still in the window. They were run by a bloke called Joe Borg, who in the late 60s, and Joe was sort of the Mr. Sin of Sydney. He had brothels everywhere. Joe, who was living at Bondi, not a particularly pleasant man, hops into his, I think, E.H. Holden ute from memory, whacks the key in the ignition, clicks the ignition on to start, which starts the gelignite under the seat, and Joe is last seen sort of flying through Bondi. That was the end of Joe. The properties very quickly came up on the market, and Dawn bought them.
For a steal.
For an absolute steal. No suggestion that she had anything to do whatsoever with his departure, but she saw a deal. She did much the same when Ludwig Goethe, the heir of Oxford Street, died and was found rolled up in a piece of carpet in the Blue Mountains. Dawn moved in at a rate of knots. She was so fast on her feet, it was terrifying.
So that being said, last words. You had a beautiful set of words last week. Do you
I
want
know I
to
could remember them.
just a last kiss goodnight to our stories and ramblings about
For this
Christmas?
place, just enjoy it for God's sake. Don't clutch your pearls. Don't turn it into Mossman Central. Go out and enjoy yourself. This place is always an oasis in Sydney. From when I was a kid, from when my father was a kid, my grandparents were kids. This is always an oasis for the sad, the mad, the bad, the odd, the interesting, the entertaining. Come and live some life here.
And the good.
And the good, and lots of good. Lots, the most wonderful community in this place. People who actually gave a damn about each other. They might be rough and tumble, whatever, who cares? This place gave a damn, and it was an oasis for anyone who was a bit strange or a bit different, or who didn't fit into that lovely quarter-acre McMansion in Borkham Hills. You could come here and be accepted for what you were. And that's the joy of this place. It was the acceptance.
I 100% agree. So everyone, let's say thank you to Duncan McNab.
Thank you.
I hope you come back and tell us more stories. Maybe the next one is Roger Rogerson.
We can do Roger.
Yeah, Roger Rogerson. I've actually never, I'm going to be bad and say that I don't know anything about that man.
He was a very good piano player.
He was.
He may come out for a day, maybe.
I would hope so. All right, thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed yourself. If you want to grab Duncan before you go, or you want to buy him a martini, please grab this man. He is a wealth of knowledge and he loves talking about the area. So thank you and talk soon.
Thank you. Thank you.